It's December, which means I have a cold, and I have a few lists for you. Hopefully you've already seen my list on my favourite books in translation of 2022, and now it is time for my best English language books of 2022. These are books that came out this year and were written in English. That's it. That's the criteria. Let's go. And number 10 is Travis Baldry's Legends and Lattes. This is a book that I read fairly recently. I got to meet him at Comic-Con. He's a lovely, sweet guy. And I'm so glad I did because I then heard of his book and read it. And it's the kind of thing that the fantasy genre really needed. Legends and Lattes tells the story of a barbarian woman called Viv, who has decided to quit her mercenary job and open up a coffee shop. This is a novel set in a very familiarly high fantasy world full of elves and dwarves and dragons, but it's a cozy novel. It's the story of a woman opening up her own business. She makes friends, she hires people, she builds the place physically. It has a found family dynamic, which is a thing I talk about a lot on this channel. I love found family in genre fiction. The characters are incredibly sweet and lovable. There is a little rat guy who is addicted to coffee, makes pastries, and can barely speak, and I will do anything for him. Anything. This is a book about friendship, about intimate stakes rather than big global catastrophes. And yet it's set in a big fantasy world where you typically see war and big scary men threatening to do bad things. This is not that. This is a cozy novel. It makes you think about the fact that whenever you read a big fantasy book with high stakes, there are ordinary people just trying to live their lives, and Viv is now one of those people. It's one of the most charming, sweet, lovely books I think I've ever read, and I actually am itching to read it again. Legends and Lattes is lovely. Number 9 is X by Davy Davis. This was published by Sappho Press, and it is a darkly, bleakly, sometimes funny story about kink and queerness and the threat of big governments. Set entirely in modern-day Brooklyn, this is the story of a non-binary protagonist who spent a really great night with a woman who goes by the name X. But in this world, people are being deported from the US if they're not quite right. If they are immigrants, if they are the wrong color or the wrong sexual orientation. And so many people are just waiting for their letter to tell them that they have to go find a new home in another country. And our protagonist suspects that X has already received her letter. And so they spend the novel searching Brooklyn for X, hoping that X will bring them some sort of happiness in life. It's a novel about the sad, fascistic state of Western governments today, especially in the US and the UK. But it's also a novel that celebrates queer communities and kink. There's a lot of kink in the novel. It is normalized. If you know anything about kink, you will enjoy the book. And it has a noir feel to it, because the world that the character is walking around is a pretty grimy one in a fun way. This is about queer neighborhoods that brush up against more dangerous areas, and the ways in which queer people risk their lives just to enjoy their community, enjoy the harmless things that we love, and the people we love. X is sometimes funny, very, very dramatic in an almost soap opera kind of way, and the political notes hit really, really hard. I can't recommend X enough. Number 8 is another recent read, which is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher, and it is my favourite horror novel that I've read this year. I have 2 more T. Kingfisher books ready to read. One is more of a fairy tale story, and another was her first horror novel, and I can't wait to read both of them. But What Moves the Dead is an incredibly gutsy book. I said this in my video. The fact that T. Kingfisher chose to take one of the most beloved and revered stories in gothic fiction and horror fiction and go, I'm going to rewrite this, make it longer, hopefully make it better. And she did. She actually did. I love Edgar Allan Poe. I love The Fall of the House of Usher. What Moves the Dead is even better, because she says that there were questions she had, and so she decided to turn those questions into themes and events and ideas that she then explores in her remake. And it adds horror. It even adds an almost kind of science fiction-y element to it. It does a lot to expand on an original Gothic story, using the elements and the legacy that the Gothic genre has created since Poe. After the death of Edgar Allan Poe, the Gothic genre continued to grow and expand in really fun ways, especially American Gothic. And T. Kingfisher uses all that to inject an old story with new life, while completely respecting what came before it. I'm so impressed by this. As a remake, and as a really chilling piece of horror fiction, What Moves the Dead is absolutely wonderful. Incredibly satisfying, nice and short. If you're a horror fan, this was my favourite horror book of the year. At number 7 is After Sappho by Selby Schwartz. This novel was published by Galley-Beggar Press and is an incredible piece of feminist fiction. It's a fragmentary story set roughly around the turn of the 20th century, the late Victorian period up to and around World War I. And all the characters in it are real. This is a novel that explores the growth of feminism during that period. It's a novel that travels across Europe, from Italy, across the pond into the US, and explores the lives of great feminist icons, most of which you probably won't have heard of. And that's another reason why this novel is so important. There is a narrative, but as I said, it is fragmented. We're looking at this particular world through the lens of feminism, and we're looking at the lives and the triumphs of these people. After Sappho is very, very powerful. It shows us where we've been and where we're going. I'm not an expert in the feminist movement, and so I can't say where feminism exactly started, but After Sappho just gives you a good idea of the journey of feminism, almost as if it were a person. Selby Schwartz has written something unlike anything I've ever read. It's a very, very special book. And it's not just celebrating feminism, but as the title suggests, also lesbian love, friendship between women, camaraderie between women. It is about the female form, it is about the female mind, it is about the power of femininity, and the power of female love. This book was really, really important to me. And I would say of all the books on this list, maybe this is the most important one. If there was one book on this list that you thought, right, what do I need to read? It's this one. This one's important. Number 6 is Lapvona by Ottessa Moshfegh. Lapvona is a piece of fantasy literary fiction, I guess. It's set in a nondescript medieval world. There is a powerful man living in a big house on top of a hill, lording it over all the working folk who till the soil in the village below. We begin with a father and son. The father isn't very nice to his son, and the son soon befriends the child of the man in the house on the big hill. And a lot of weird stuff happens after that. This is a very, very strange, pseudo-surreal piece of fantastical fiction. For example, there is a woman, an old woman, a kind of witch, that lives at the edge of the village, who has played wet nurse to almost every single person in the village. It's also a pretty graphic story. There is a drought, there is death, pretty brutal death. There is eye gouging. Well, not really gouging. Eye removal. And in spite of what Moshfegh herself says, and I do think she sometimes has fun just trolling journalists and her own audience, it's a pretty political novel about the ways in which the powerful hoard their wealth and lord it over the rest of us and make the rest of us suffer for them. There are a lot of obvious and angry socialist themes in this story. It's great for fantasy fans. It's arguably good for historical fiction fans. It's very obviously political, aggressively so. And it's one of those novels that is very bleak and full of pretty gross, disgusting things. And yet, because I like all that stuff, I would call it really fun. Kind of like Cormac McCarthy. Cormac McCarthy's books are all pretty bleak, are often full of blood and gore and death, and horrible people doing horrible things, and yet I always have fun reading them. And I don't really know what other word to use except fun, and the same is true here with Lapvona. I have fun with it. I don't know what that says about me, but I really like Lapvona. Into my top 5, and at number 5 is How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. What's interesting and kind of daring about this book, published in 2022, is that it is a sci-fi book about a pandemic, which means it hits pretty hard. But it's also one of the smartest pieces of science fiction you'll ever read. In one sense, it is a short story collection, but not really, because it does follow one chronological narrative. Every chapter follows a different character, and some characters reappear in other chapters, or are briefly mentioned in them, which creates a nice kind of narrative circle. We begin in a crater in Siberia. The permafrost is melting thanks to climate change, and a real fear that real scientists have is ancient, long-dead viruses thawing from the permafrost, leaking into our water supply, and spreading across the globe. And that's what happens. An aging scientist recently lost his daughter at this very site. She died, and so he, also being a leading scientist in the same field, goes to her site, kind of continues her work, and unleashes a virus. From here, each chapter jumps forward a few years or just a few months and examines what this virus has done to the world. This particular virus in the novel mostly targets children. Adults can get it, but they're usually fine. Children are not. After the first chapter, the second chapter is perhaps the most memorable one in terms of what happens. And we follow a man who takes a job at a theme park in California. And this theme park is designed to euthanize terminal children, give them a kinder, happier death, where they hop onto a roller coaster, their parents wave them off, everything's fine, and by the time the roller coaster finishes, they have been painlessly knocked out and euthanized. Every chapter explores a slightly different avenue of science fiction. For example, the third chapter is about accidentally making a pig a little bit too intelligent, to the point that it's able to communicate telepathically with its human, in a way that the human can understand. And that itself is linked back to the virus. Everything is. So there are a lot of different sci-fi concepts being explored in each chapter, which in a way is a standalone story within this world, but you must read it chronologically as a single novel. It's very clever, the way that Nagamatsu is blending the short story technique, the rules of the short story, with a linear narrative. Very, very clever stuff. Very smart science fiction, a lot of it based on real ideas, real fears, real concepts, a real future that we might be moving towards, and how we might survive that future, or at least handle it. I could talk about this book a lot, and I already have. I have a video on it, but I really, really loved it. And I found myself now rambling a little bit more about this one than my others, because I'm remembering so much of it as I think, as I talk, and it's a real doozy of a book. Moving up to a much, much happier note, we have Nettle Black by Nat Reeve. I had the pleasure earlier this year of interviewing Nat Reeve as part of a panel of queer writers. It was an incredible event. I hosted it, and it's the proudest thing I've done with my year. And that also meant that I got to talk to Nat Reeve, and they are just the coolest person. They are very, very quirky in a really fun way, in a specifically fashion and linguistics way. Nat Reeve is a very unique person, a beautiful personality. As for what Nettle Black is about, it is a piece of historical fiction about a Welsh family who are nouveau riche. They have built a product and built their name around this product, and one of the daughters of this family, who all live in Surrey now, is about to get married off to someone, and she doesn't want that. She doesn't want to get married off, and so she sneaks out of the house, and through a series of very strange and wonderful circumstances, she ends up accidentally being recruited into this local vigilante group. They are not the local police force. They are people who kind of take the law into their own hands and try to stop all of the small crimes that happen in their tiny little Surrey English village. Along the way, our protagonist learns a lot about her sexual orientation and her gender identity, as she meets a very foppish, flamboyant, non-binary character, although that word is never used, because this is a Victorian story. And I said in my review that in many ways this novel reminds me of Hot Fuzz, one of my favourite comedy films. Because you've got a small group of people following the law in a small town where not much happens until it does. Until a lot happens. And it becomes a kind of mystery story. But our main focus is our protagonist, and the personal, emotional journey that she goes through. You've got an enormous cast of characters that remind me of the flamboyant and campish, cartoonish characters that you find in Dickens or Terry Pratchett books. And for that reason, Nettle Black should stand the test of time as a great, funny, quirky, beautiful piece of historical fiction and queer fiction. It is bright and playful and celebratory It is warm and sweet. It is lovely. Nettle Black is a lovely, clever, savvy, beautifully written, very funny story. Laugh out loud funny, and in just the most charming way possible. I love Nettle Black so much. What a wonderful way to spend your time is reading this novel. And number 3, we have a book that really took me by surprise, and that is Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson. I picked this book up because Juno Dawson is a legendary writer within the transgender community, and because I've enjoyed a lot of books related to witches recently. And I heard that this is a book that sort of toes the line between YA urban fantasy and adult urban fantasy. And I thought, yeah, let's try this out. And then, because of a twist that happens about 40-45% of the way through the book, which you can learn about more if you watch my video on the book, thanks to that twist, the book becomes intensely political. It's suddenly a book very much about modern-day British politics. And the way that those politics are handled and discussed by the characters in the book had me suddenly go from thinking this is a decent piece of witchy urban fantasy to something very special, very important, talking about something, allegoricalizing something very important to me and to all of us in Britain right now. As for what it's about, Her Majesty's Royal Coven is set in the modern day, half in London, half in Hebden Bridge up in the north, and it's about 4 friends who were very close as children. They're now 4 women in their mid-30s, 2 of them have kids, and they're all witches. The titular Her Majesty's Royal Coven is a kind of MI5 situation, but for witches. A small percentage of people in the world have magical powers and are either witches or warlocks. And there is a very powerful young child who is discovered and taken in by Her Majesty's Royal Coven because he is dangerous and uniquely, strangely powerful. And he is the catalyst of the whole plot. And if you want to learn more, go watch my video on it. But as I said, the fact that this book blends savvy, modern, queer politics with fun, urban fantasy lore and storytelling and witchy characters doing witchy magic, I couldn't get enough of it. And I'm thrilled to find out it is the first book in a trilogy. So we've got a lot more fun to come. Her Majesty's Royal Coven is one of the most fun, engaging, and satisfying books I've read this year. If you've been following my channel for most of this year, then my top 2 books probably won't surprise you. Because not only are they my favourite English language books of this year, but they're also my 2 favourite novels of this year, full stop. And number 2 is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This was a really early read for me. I think I read and reviewed it in February, and it has remained at the top of my list ever since. Shortly after the book came out, I got to watch a talk between Julia Armfield, Alison Rumfitt, and Rivers Solomon, which was a very special evening, and I also got to meet Julia at a book event recently, and she is just lovely. Our Wives Under the Sea is her debut novel following her short story collection Salt Slow. And Our Wives Under the Sea tells the story of a married couple. One of them is a scientist who is sent in a submarine down to the bottom of the ocean to do some science stuff. She's supposed to be down there for a few weeks, and things go wrong, and she is trapped down there with a small crew of people for 6 months. That is one narrative. It is the shorter narrative that we follow. The other larger narrative that we spend more time with is that of her wife, who, when our scientist returns, has to nurse her back to health. And she is not the same. She has come back changed, and her wife must deal with that. This is a gothic novel set in the modern day about grief and how we grieve. On the one hand, you follow a kind of claustrophobic horror story about weird things happening in and outside of a submarine. And on the other hand, you have a story of loss and change and grief. We get flashbacks to how these women met, their early dating life, how they fell in love, and then we look at where they are now, and the fact that one of them is barely there anymore. When she returns, she's doing weird things. She's running the bathtub. She's barely speaking. She sits and stares at the TV. She's not communicating in a normal way. She has come back wrong, and her wife must figure out, what do I do here? She asks herself so many questions. She thinks about going to a hospital. She thinks about turning to her wife's employers to find out what the hell happened. And all of these things are dealt with in their own way, but it's really about what she does, how she handles the situation. And we learn a lot about grief, and as I said in my review, this is kind of a book about the fact that we can grieve wrong. There are right and wrong ways of grieving both change and loss, sometimes at the same time. It's a really, really incredible piece of Gothic fiction, and also a very powerful literary novel about grief and loss. And it really had me thinking, it really had me reevaluating the concept of grief, and I'm so grateful to it for that. This is one of my favourite Gothic novels of all time. It is a masterpiece, and it's one of the best books of this year. And my favourite novel of this year, my number one best book of 2022, is Orpheus Builds a Girl by Heather Parry. This is also a Gothic novel, and it is inspired by real people and real events. But, as I said in my review, what is unique about Orpheus Builds a Girl is that it pays homage to the great horror and Gothic stories of the early 19th century. This is a book that feels like it fits on a shelf alongside things like Wuthering Heights and Frankenstein. The language, the tone, the way that the characters think and feel and behave is incredibly Gothic. There is so much melodrama here. There is so much passion, so much Shakespearean energy to these characters. They are tragic, they are cruel, they are broken. This is also a story that is incredibly feminist, about setting records straight, about rewriting masculine and patriarchal narratives. There is a kind of framing device, which is this. A German scientist moves to Florida post-World War II, and we are reading his biography as he writes it, about what he did in his early days, his relationship to his family, and then what he got up to once he was in Florida. But this manuscript is being annotated by a woman that he knew who wishes to set the record straight. And so we have a dual narrative of his biography and hers. We read his chapters, and then she jumps in after each one to say, this is what happened to me, this is what happened to my sister, and this is what really happened. And that pair of sisters are from Cuba, and they also end up in Florida. One of them gets sick and is treated by this German scientist, who ends up falling in love with her, and things get very, very dark and Gothic. And from this point on, it really feels like Frankenstein. Now, Frankenstein is my favourite novel, and a book that reminds me of it in terms of its tone, its themes, its writing, its language, its characters, is going to be a new favourite of mine. But the fact that this is also an intensely feminist novel about correcting patriarchal narratives is incredibly important and satisfying to read. Heather Parry has written a true Gothic masterpiece for many different reasons. Go watch my review and you can learn all of my thoughts. But Orpheus Builds a Girl is, in my opinion, the best novel written in English this year. Please read it, please check it out, it is perfect. Okay, there you go. That was my top 10 English language books of this year, all published in 2022. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, consider subscribing to my Patreon at patreon.com/booksandbow. I've got new benefits for patrons coming in January, and subscribe for books.